show.
Only one man stands as Mr. Olympia every year. This means that the hundreds of thousands of people who couldn't even step foot on the Olympia stage have so far to go to become a pro. For the pros themselves, although a lot closer, still have what seems like a daunting and uncertain path just to reach the stage itself. For those on stage, getting to the top 10 or even the top 5 is something that, like previously mentioned, could only dream of. If you're in the top 3, then you're getting into position to win. However, as they say, second place is the first loser. To think you are one place away from being the best in the world. But you're not. Many people can dust themselves off, try again and ultimately succeed. But what if you don't? What if, try as you might, you can never win and you constantly remain uncrowned? This happens a lot, with many uncrowned kings, as they're called, being more popular than the Mr. Olympias themselves. We've seen this with many faces over the years, all the way up to the present day, with each one showing darker parts of the sport's history, from bias to it being rigged. But who deserved it the most? Who is the best loser? Mike Mensa is one of the first that comes to mind when you try and look a bit further back throughout the sport's history. Now, of course, there are many bodybuilders who should have won before him. However, 1980 was a turning point for the sport where it started to get more popular and take off. It had been 5 whole years since the superstar Arnold Schwarzenegger had retired, and Mensa was looking likely to be the next golden boy. He won the majority of his shows he'd entered since he started competing, with him only placing outside the top 3 once in his second ever show at 20 years old. He'd won every major show at this time, including the Mr. America, and of course the most famous win being the 1978 Mr. Universe, where he got a perfect score, the first and last man to ever do so. In his first ever Olympia in 1979, he won his weight class, but came up short to a well-peaked Frank Zane. Next year though would be his for sure. But we all know what happened next. Arnold made a last-minute entry to the show, looking at his worst. He had suffered an injury, forcing him to take medication which held onto water, meaning he was soft and lacked a lot of clarity in the prejudging. Granted, he did improve over time, but ultimately many had Mensa on top with his improved clarity and incredible performance at the show. But if we're being honest, Mensa was slightly off as well. Yet, not enough to say that Mensa shouldn't have won. He was on in most aspects, and to most people, he was the winner. But Arnold won. After this, the sport itself went into a bit of a tumultuous time for a while, but eventually caught itself, ready for the sport's greatest period, full of legends, with all but 2 remaining uncrowned. The 1990s was the peak of the sport, with there being a plethora of bodybuilders who at any time could have taken it. However, as stated before, only one man stands tall as Mr. Olympia every year, and during the 90s, only one man stood tall for 6 of those. Dorian Yates dominated, with no one coming close whenever he was on. Sad thing is though, many bodybuilders did come close whenever he was on, and I could run off a list, but the 90s was significant for 4 main bodybuilders. Shawn Ray was the last of his kind. Coming in at the end of the golden era of the sport, he saw it right to continue on what made the sport so amazing, choosing to prioritize lines and symmetry coupled with aesthetics and class over just being an absolute freak. He believed that one day he would become Mr. Olympia, yet the sport wasn't in line with Shawn, nor did it like Shawn. It was moving away from aesthetics and moving towards mass and conditioning, the type that we know all too well today. This meant he was being overshadowed by most of his competition for his size or lack thereof. It didn't help that Shawn was very outspoken about the issues of the sport and poked holes into how it was run. Lack of pay, poor judging, or stubbornness not to change the judges at all was always brought up by Shawn, leading to him losing his placings in the sport. That didn't stop him from placing second twice though in both 1994 and 1996, and you can arguably say he deserved one against Dorian with a pulled bicep and a lack of conditioning. Nasser El Sambati had a similar fate, with maybe this time being even worse. Nasser, unlike Shawn, came in with the explosion of the mass monsters, meaning he had impressive mass from the start. With him doing reasonably well in the first few years of his pro career, he would soon get his big break. In 1997, Dorian was at the end of the road. He still had incredible mass for sure, but at this point it didn't mean a lot to just be big. With most of the top 8 all being mass monsters, he needed something else. Something he didn't have. At this time he had his pulled bicep from a few years prior, but he had just recently pulled his tricep. on the same arm, meaning he was competing with just one arm. To add to that, he could barely train leading up to the show, meaning his condition wasn't up to par and his shape was way off. Nasser was on. A year after failing his diuretics test, he still managed to maintain a stellar condition with impeccable fullness and shape. To everyone, he was the easy pick. But he lost. And after this, Nasser would never have another opportunity to win the Olympia, leaving him depressed and in a state of confusion, with him not knowing what to do after the show, torn between whether to cry or to punch a hole in the wall. After the show though, Dorian Yates retired. To this point, Yates had beaten everyone, leaving most of them in the dust, never to do as good, but two men still had more fight in them. Approaching the 1998 Mr. Olympia with the title vacant, many thought that they would win the show, but one was above the rest. Everyone knew that he would win, and he himself was so confident that he got posters made claiming that he was already Mr. Olympia before the show had even started. Flex Wheeler had already placed second before in his debut in 1993. He was easily the most symmetrical on stage, and he coupled mass and shape so well that he, again, was next up in most people's eyes. As he entered the show, the rhetoric never changed, and he was on top for most of it. However, as the show went on, another man was making the rounds. As he showed up in more and more call-outs, people began to notice someone else. Yet there was no worrying. Flex was still sat atop all of the legends, all of which were in the discussion of winning. Surely this nobody from 9th place will never even step foot in the top 5. As the announcements were made though, he made the top 5, and then the top 4. And then the top 3, beating out all of the legends at this point. Yet, Flex was still there, but try as he might, and with all the hype and media behind him, it wasn't his day, and Ronnie Coleman ended up winning the show. The last of the 4 is the most popular. This is because Kevin Levrone is seen as the most deserving uncrowned bodybuilder of all time, placing second at the Olympia 4 times in the span of a decade against both an impeccable Dorian and Ronnie, which is incredibly impressive knowing that after his first ever Olympia he actually pulled his pec, meaning that he did drop a few places, but his genetics was so good that he ended up coming back to be the winningest bodybuilder of all time. But now, everyone knows the story of Kevin, and it's a shame that he never ended up winning because at any other time, he would have. He was the most consistent of all the bodybuilders mentioned, and due to his effort not being rewarded, he retired, never to win a show again. Since this time, we have had a number of bodybuilders fail to win the Olympia, landing themselves in the uncrowned category, with one man ultimately escaping the realm of the uncrowned and going on to win a few Olympias for himself and making himself a legend. However, not long after, another man just came at the wrong time. Sparking the most interesting rivalry in the sport's history, Kai Greene was one of the most unique bodybuilders ever, with passionate and stylistic posing routines which went along with his unique and amazing personality. To back it, he had one of the best backs on stage, coupled with an incredibly full and well-proportioned physique, landing him in the winning spot for major pro shows, and more famously, the Arnold Classic. But there was one show that he could never win: the Olympia. He had the unfortunate timing of sharing the stage with a gift, Phil Heath, who had insane everything with little to no weak points, leaving Kai Greene to place second 3 times before ultimately retiring from the sport. Being an uncrowned king is potentially one of the most bittersweet positions to be as a bodybuilder. To most people, it's common knowledge that you deserve to be Mr. Olympia, leading to widespread love all over the community. But ultimately, you're not. You're not Mr. Olympia. You lost.